February 13, 1981. 28,000 feet above the Bekaa Valley, Lebanon. Through the canopy of his MiG-25 Foxbat, a Syrian Air Force pilot scanned the horizon with absolute confidence. The most advanced interceptor in the Soviet arsenal surrounded him, a machine capable of Mach 3.2, a fighter that Western intelligence had feared for 15 years. Below him, Israeli F-15 Eagles prowled the Lebanese sky, but the Syrian pilot felt no concern. Soviet instructors had drilled one certainty into every Foxbat pilot: nothing could catch you. Nothing could outrun you. The MiG-25 was untouchable. His radar warning receiver remained silent as he positioned for attack. The Syrian pilot had trained in the Soviet Union, flown with instructors who spoke of the Foxbat with reverence bordering on worship. They called it the pinnacle of Soviet aviation engineering, a titanium demon that made Western fighters obsolete before they left the drawing board. The aircraft could reach 80,000 feet, cruise at 2.83 times the speed of sound, and carry missiles no enemy could evade. What the Syrian pilot did not know, what no Soviet instructor had told him, was that everything he believed about his aircraft was about to be proven catastrophically wrong. Within seconds, an American-designed fighter would destroy his MiG-25 in a manner that Soviet aviation engineers had declared impossible. The engagement would last less than 30 seconds. The myth of Soviet interceptor supremacy would die even faster. The transformation from Soviet confidence to documented Israeli air superiority would take 18 months. In that time, the Foxbat, once described by United States Air Force Secretary Robert Seamans as probably the best interceptor in production worldwide, would become known in Israeli and American circles as the most overrated fighter ever built. This is the story of how Soviet propaganda created a phantom menace, how one defector's courage revealed the truth, and how American engineering philosophy buried Soviet aviation doctrine under a mountain of wreckage. The MiG-25 Foxbat emerged from Soviet paranoia about American strategic bombers. In 1964, the United States unveiled the XB-70 Valkyrie, a Mach 3 strategic bomber designed to penetrate Soviet airspace at 70,000 feet and 3 times the speed of sound. Soviet air defense commanders, already humiliated by 4 years of unstoppable U-2 overflights, demanded an interceptor capable of destroying these high-altitude threats. The Mikoyan-Gurevich Design Bureau responded with the Ye-155, prototype of what would become the MiG-25. Chief designer Mikhail Gurevich faced an impossible specification. The aircraft needed to reach Mach 3, climb to 80,000 feet, and carry heavy air-to-air missiles. No Soviet engine could provide the necessary thrust without melting. Titanium, the logical material for high-speed flight, was scarce and expensive in the Soviet Union. Every design choice became a compromise between capability and industrial reality. Gurevich's solution shocked Western intelligence when it was finally revealed. The MiG-25's primary structure used nickel-steel alloy, not titanium. Steel was cheap, abundant, and easily welded by semi-skilled workers. The aircraft weighed approximately 81,000 pounds fully loaded, making it one of the heaviest single-seat fighters ever built. Its 2 Tumansky R-15B-300 engines, essentially modified cruise missile power plants, produced 22,500 pounds of thrust each at maximum afterburner. On March 6, 1964, test pilot Alexander Fedotov flew the prototype for the first time. The aircraft climbed like a rocket, but handled, in Fedotov's carefully worded official report, with unique characteristics. Soviet test pilots developed an unofficial description that was far more direct. The MiG-25 flew like a freight train on rails. It could not turn. It could not maneuver. It could only go straight and fast. But the Soviet Union did not need a dogfighter. They needed an interceptor to destroy American bombers before they could deliver nuclear weapons. For this mission, The MiG-25's limitations did not matter. Speed and altitude were everything. Maneuverability was irrelevant against a bomber flying straight and level. The first production MiG-25P interceptors entered service in 1970 with Soviet air defense forces. NATO assigned it the reporting name Foxbat and immediately designated it a critical threat. Western intelligence, observing the massive twin-tailed fighter at Soviet air shows, made assumptions based on its appearance and performance demonstrations. Those assumptions were completely wrong. Western analysts, knowing the aircraft exceeded Mach 3, concluded it must be constructed of titanium like the American SR-71 Blackbird. They observed its size and assumed it carried sophisticated avionics and powerful radar. They watched it climb and calculated it must possess extraordinary maneuverability. Intelligence estimates credited the Foxbat with capabilities that existed only in Soviet propaganda and Western imagination. The deception was systematic and deliberate. Soviet authorities carefully controlled what Western observers could see. Foxbat pilots performing at air shows flew specific profiles designed to suggest capabilities the aircraft did not possess. The Soviets released just enough information to fuel Western fears while concealing every weakness. Soviet military journals published articles praising the Foxbat's advanced technology without providing technical details. The myth grew with each carefully managed revelation. Soviet pilots knew the truth, but could never speak it. Lieutenant Viktor Ivanovich Belenko, assigned to the 513th Fighter Regiment in Siberia, flew the MiG-25P interceptor variant from 1971 onward. His experience with the aircraft revealed the vast gulf between propaganda and reality. The cockpit instrumentation belonged in a 1940s bomber. Vacuum tube electronics filled the equipment bays, technology Western fighters had abandoned 20 years earlier. The radar, designated RP-25 Smerch, could barely distinguish ground clutter from aircraft and jammed easily. The hydraulic systems leaked constantly. The fuel system burned through kerosene so quickly that maximum afterburner endurance measured in minutes. Most critically, the flight control system made sustained maneuvering impossible. At high speed, the controls became nearly immovable, requiring both hands on the stick for even gentle turns. Pull too hard, and the aircraft's steel structure would permanently deform. Soviet flight manuals specified absolute maximum limits of 2.2 g at Mach 2.83 and 4.5 g at lower speeds. Any combat requiring sharp turns or aggressive maneuvering was beyond the aircraft's capability. Belenko and his fellow pilots discussed these limitations privately, in whispers, never in writing. Criticizing Soviet aviation technology meant ending your career, or worse. But Belenko began to question everything about his service, his aircraft, and the system that had produced both. While Soviet pilots flew a propaganda creation disguised as a fighter, American engineers were building something entirely different. The F-15 Eagle emerged from lessons learned in Vietnam, where American fighters designed around nuclear attack missions struggled against nimble Soviet-built MiGs. The United States Air Force issued requirements in 1965 for a new air superiority fighter optimized for one purpose: destroying enemy aircraft. McDonnell Douglas won the contract with a radical design philosophy. The F-15 would not compromise. It would be the best air-to-air fighter possible, regardless of cost or complexity. Chief Engineer Dave Lewis assembled a team that pursued performance with almost religious dedication. They wanted speed, climb rate, acceleration, maneuverability, range, weapons capacity, and electronics that would make the pilot the most informed combatant in the sky. The F-15 that first flew on July 27, 1972, represented American engineering at its most ambitious. Two Pratt & Whitney F-100 turbofan engines provided approximately 47,660 pounds of thrust, enough to accelerate the 44,000-pound fighter vertically. The wing design, with a loading of just 54 pounds per square foot, allowed 9 G-turns at combat weight. The Hughes APG-63 radar could track multiple targets simultaneously at ranges exceeding 100 miles. But it was the flight control system that truly set the F-15 apart. Hydraulically boosted controls gave the pilot complete authority at any speed. Electronic stability augmentation prevented departures from controlled flight. The pilot could maneuver at maximum G-forces from sea level to 60,000 feet without fear of losing control. American test pilots, accustomed to fighters that required careful handling, discovered an aircraft that responded instantly to thought. Early test results shocked even the Air Force. In 1973, test pilot Irv Burrows demonstrated sustained 9 G-turns at 30,000 feet. The F-15 accelerated from Mach 0.9 to Mach 2.3 in less than 2 minutes. Zoom climbs reached 65,000 feet. The aircraft could dogfight, run, climb, or dive with equal effectiveness. Soviet intelligence observed F-15 development with growing concern. Reports from America described performance that seemed impossible, an aircraft that, large and heavy, should not maneuver like a lightweight fighter. Soviet engineers analyzed the available data and concluded the Americans were exaggerating. No fighter could simultaneously optimize speed, agility, and combat persistence. The laws of physics made such performance impossible. The first F-15. A models entered service with the 1st Tactical Fighter Wing at Langley Air Force Base, Virginia, in January 1976. American pilots, many of them Vietnam veterans, approached the new fighter with curiosity mixed with skepticism. The F-15 was enormous compared to the F-4 Phantom, with a wingspan of 42 feet 9 inches and a length of 63 feet 9 inches. It looked more like a light bomber than a dogfighter. Then they flew it. Captain Roger Wells, an F-4 pilot with 2 Vietnam kills, completed his first F-15 training flight and told his squadron commander one thing: every enemy pilot who faces this aircraft is already dead. The Israeli Air Force, observing F-15 performance in American service, immediately recognized a strategic game-changer. Israel faced numerically superior Arab air forces equipped with the latest Soviet fighters, including MiG-21s, MiG-23s, and the feared MiG-25s. Israeli pilots had fought 3 wars flying French Mirages and captured Soviet aircraft. They understood air combat intimately and recognized that the F-15 represented a generational leap in capability. Negotiations began in 1975. The Israeli government, led by Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, requested immediate delivery of the new fighter. The United States, concerned about maintaining technological advantages and regional balance, agreed to the sale. On December 10, 1976, the first F-15, A-Baz, Hebrew for Falcon, arrived in Israel. The timing was significant. Just 3 months after Belenko's defection revealed MiG-25 limitations, Israel received the weapon designed to counter it. Israeli pilots, veterans of 3 wars, began training immediately. Israeli Air Force doctrine emphasized aggressive exploitation of technological advantage. Unlike American pilots who trained for specific scenarios, Israeli fighter pilots practiced free-form combat where anything could happen. They flew against their own Mirage fighters, against A-4 Skyhawks simulating MiGs, against anything that could create realistic combat pressure. Israeli Air Force doctrine emphasized aggressive exploitation of technological advantage. Unlike American pilots who trained for specific scenarios, Israeli fighter pilots practiced free-form combat where anything could happen. They flew against their own Mirage fighters, against A-4 Skyhawks simulating MiGs, against anything that could create realistic combat pressure. The F-15 exceeded every expectation. Israeli test pilot Colonel Benny Zinker, who had flown every fighter in Israeli inventory, reported that the Eagle gave Israel a 20-year technological lead over any potential adversary. Its radar could track Syrian fighters taking off from Damascus, while the F-15 orbited over Israel. Its missiles could engage targets before enemy pilots knew they were under attack. In close combat, nothing Soviet-built could match its turn rate or energy retention. But Israeli intelligence, like their American counterparts, continued to fear the MiG-25. Soviet advisors in Syria operated Foxbat reconnaissance variants that overflew Israel with impunity, flying too high and too fast for Israeli fighters or missiles to reach. These flights, arrogant demonstrations of Soviet technical superiority, reminded Israel that the Soviet Union possessed capabilities Israel could not counter. On September 6, 1976, the illusion shattered. Lieutenant Viktor Belenko, 30 years old and completely disillusioned with Soviet life, executed the most damaging defection in Cold War aviation history. He departed his base at Chuguyevka during a routine training flight with several other pilots from his regiment. At first, to avoid revealing his intentions, Belenko followed the standard flight plan meticulously. Then, at the far end of the training circuit, he did not turn back toward base as flight doctrine required. Instead, he continued eastward and descended rapidly to 100 feet above the Sea of Japan, flying below radar coverage. The MiG-25, heavy and fuel-hungry, was never designed for low-altitude flight. At this height, fuel consumption increased dramatically. Belenko had brought the aircraft's technical manual with him, something strictly forbidden on operational flights. He knew he would need it to help American engineers understand the aircraft. His squadron mates, realizing something was wrong, pursued him. But the MiG-25's limitations worked in Belenko's favor. The heavy fighter could not maneuver well at low altitude. His pursuers could not catch him before he crossed into Japanese airspace. As he approached Japan, Belenko climbed to reveal himself on Japanese radar, popping up periodically to ensure he would not be shot down as an intruder. Poor weather and the limitations of Japanese Air Self-Defense Force F-4E Phantoms prevented them from locating Belenko to provide escort. He had planned to land at Chitose Air Base, the only military airfield shown on his map, but weather and fuel depletion forced him to divert to Hakodate Civilian Airport. He circled the field 3 times, nearly colliding with a departing Boeing 727 airliner on his approach. The Hakodate runway, at 6,500 feet, was dangerously short for the MiG-25. Despite deploying his drag parachute and applying maximum braking, the aircraft overran the runway by nearly 800 feet. When Japanese police arrived at 14:10 hours, they found Belenko climbing from his cockpit. He had 30 seconds of fuel remaining. When questioned, he stated clearly that he wanted political asylum in the United States. The Japanese, stunned to see a Soviet interceptor at their civilian airport, immediately contacted American authorities. The Soviet Union demanded Belenko's return and the immediate repatriation of the aircraft. Soviet embassy officials met with Belenko on September 9th, attempting to persuade him to return. He refused categorically. President Gerald Ford granted him political asylum, and he was flown to the United States on September 10th. The MiG-25 remained in Japan. Soviet pressure mounted for its return, but Japanese and American engineers needed time to examine it. The aircraft was too large to move by Japanese transport planes. On September the 25th, it was partially disassembled and loaded onto a United States Air Force Lockheed C-5A Galaxy cargo transport. A banner on the aircraft read, in Japanese, "Goodbye people of Hakodate, sorry for the trouble." F-4 Phantoms escorted the Galaxy from Hokkaido to Hyakuri Air Base, north of Tokyo. Within hours, United States Air Force intelligence teams were examining the Foxbat in minute detail. What they discovered transformed Western understanding of Soviet aviation engineering. The aircraft was crude beyond belief. The fuselage construction used 18-gauge steel sheets, welded by hand with visible irregularities. Rivets protruded from the skin, increasing drag. The cockpit instrumentation looked antiquated, with mechanical gauges, vacuum tubes, and systems that Western fighters had abandoned in the 1950s. The radar, supposedly the most advanced Soviet airborne system, used technology from the Korean War era. The aircraft was crude beyond belief. The fuselage construction used 18-gauge steel sheets, welded by hand with visible irregularities. Rivets protruded from the skin, increasing drag. The cockpit instrumentation looked antiquated, with mechanical gauges, vacuum tubes, and systems that Western fighters had abandoned in the 1950s. The radar, supposedly the most advanced Soviet airborne system, used technology from the Korean War. But the greatest revelation came from materials analysis. American engineers had assumed the MiG-25 used titanium throughout its structure. Instead, they found nickel steel, a material chosen for cheapness and ease of manufacture rather than performance. The aircraft was not a technological marvel. It was an industrial compromise designed for mass production by workers with minimal skills using readily available materials. The flight control system analysis revealed even more disturbing limitations. American test pilots, reviewing the control forces required at high speed, concluded that combat maneuvering was essentially impossible. The pilot would need superhuman strength to pull more than 3 G-turns at Mach 2.5. The structural analysis confirmed load limits far below American standards. The MiG-25 was a one-trick pony, fast in a straight line but unable to fight. Soviet embassy officials in Tokyo desperately demanded the aircraft's return, but Japanese authorities, under American pressure, continued the evaluation for 67 days. American engineers photographed every component, measured every dimension, and tested every system. They discovered vacuum tubes that had been obsolete in the West for 20 years, radar components that belonged in museum displays, hydraulic pumps that leaked continuously. The Central Intelligence Agency issued a classified assessment that fundamentally revised Soviet threat estimates. The MiG-25 was not the technological leap Western intelligence had feared. It was a paper tiger, an aircraft designed to destroy one specific threat, the B-70 bomber that no longer existed. The United States had cancelled the B-70 program in 1969 after building only 2 prototypes. The Soviets had built hundreds of interceptors to counter a bomber America never deployed. Soviet humiliation was complete when Belenko, granted asylum in the United States, began providing detailed testimony. He described fuel systems so inefficient that combat air patrol time was measured in minutes. He revealed that engine overhaul was required every 150 hours because the power plants operated at temperatures that degraded metals constantly. He explained that the radar could barely see fighter-sized targets beyond 50 kilometers, a fraction of Western capabilities. Most damaging was Belenko's assessment of Soviet pilot quality. Training was minimal. Flight time was restricted because of fuel shortages and maintenance problems. Pilots received limited information about their aircraft's capabilities or limitations. Soviet aviation was built on quantity, not quality, accepting poor performance because producing thousands of mediocre aircraft was cheaper than hundreds of excellent ones. The Soviet response to Belenko's defection revealed the damage. The entire 513th Fighter Regiment was disbanded. Every officer who had known Belenko faced investigation by the KGB. Belenko's wife and son were interrogated repeatedly. His commanding officers were demoted or dismissed. Security procedures at Soviet air bases across the country were completely revised. New regulations prohibited pilots from carrying technical manuals on flights. Flight plans were monitored more closely. Pilots faced increased political indoctrination. But the damage to Soviet prestige could not be repaired. The myth of the invincible Foxbat had been destroyed by one disgruntled pilot and 67 days of American analysis. Japanese authorities returned the aircraft to the Soviet Union on November 15, 1976, disassembled in 30 wooden crates. Soviet officials insisted on inspecting each crate before accepting delivery. They discovered, to their fury, that American and Japanese engineers had photographed every component, measured every dimension, and tested every system. Nothing remained secret. The intelligence windfall influenced American aircraft development for years. The F-15 program, already well advanced when Belenko defected, received validation. American designers had pursued the correct path. Speed alone meant nothing without maneuverability, reliability, and effective weapons systems. The revelation that Soviet fighters used crude technology and accepted poor reliability to achieve simple mass production vindicated American emphasis on quality over quantity. Israeli intelligence received the complete American assessment. Israeli Air Force planners, studying the data, realized the MiG-25 was vulnerable to tactics the F-15 could execute perfectly. The Foxbat's inability to maneuver meant it could not evade missiles. Its antiquated radar meant it could not detect threats until they were close. Its limited fuel capacity meant extended combat was impossible. The supposedly unstoppable interceptor could be destroyed if engaged properly. The opportunity came on February 13, 1981. Syrian Air Force MiG-25 reconnaissance aircraft had been overflying Israeli positions in Lebanon for months, photographing Israeli deployments with impunity. The Israeli Air Force decided to end these provocative flights. They positioned F-15 patrols at altitudes and locations where they could intercept the high-flying Foxbats. The Syrian pilot, confident in his MiG-25's reputation, never saw his killers. Israeli F-15 pilot Benny Zinker, commanding officer of No. 133 Squadron, was flying at 30,000 feet with his radar scanning high altitude when he acquired the Foxbat at 90 kilometers range. The Syrian pilot, relying on Soviet assurances of the Foxbat's invincibility, was flying straight and level at Mach 2.35, exactly as Soviet doctrine prescribed. Zinker, following Israeli tactics developed specifically for this engagement, positioned himself below and behind the Syrian fighter. The Hughes radar maintained perfect track despite the target's speed. At 35 kilometers range, still beyond the Syrians' radar detection capability, Zinker fired 2 AM-7 Sparrow radar-guided missiles. The missiles, accelerating to Mach 3.5, closed on the supersonic target in seconds. The Syrian pilot's radar warning receiver, designed to detect threats from ahead, never indicated the danger approaching from his 6 o'clock position. The first Sparrow's proximity fuse detonated 20 feet from the MiG-25's left engine. Shrapnel from the continuous rod warhead shredded the engine and punctured fuel tanks. The second missile, launched as insurance, passed through the expanding debris cloud and detonated near the cockpit. The MiG-25, traveling at 1,750 miles per hour at the moment of impact, began tumbling. The steel structure, never designed for violent maneuvering, twisted under aerodynamic loads. Pieces of tail section separated. The canopy, already cracked by overpressure, blew away completely. The Syrian pilot, if he survived the initial explosions, faced an impossible situation. Ejecting at Mach 2.35 in a tumbling aircraft exceeded the seat's design limits. Israeli ground radar tracked the flaming wreckage falling toward Lebanese territory. The engagement, from first radar contact to aircraft destruction, lasted 37 seconds. The first ever combat kill of a MiG-25 Foxbat had been accomplished without the Israeli pilot ever entering visual range. Soviet instructors had trained Syrian pilots that nothing could catch a Foxbat at high altitude and high speed. They had been catastrophically wrong. The Soviet Union immediately dispatched a technical investigation team to Syria to interview surviving Syrian Air Force pilots and recover any Foxbat wreckage. The team, led by engineers from the Mikoyan Design Bureau, needed to understand how an F-15 had killed a Mach 3 interceptor. Syrian pilots, shaken by the loss, provided details that Soviet analysts found disturbing. The F-15 had not pursued the MiG-25 in a high-speed chase, as Soviet doctrine assumed would be necessary. Instead, the American-designed fighter had used its sophisticated radar to track the target and launch missiles from beyond visual range. The engagement had required no maneuvering, no high-speed pursuit, no dramatic dogfight. The F-15 pilot had simply detected, tracked, fired, and confirmed the kill. Soviet engineers analyzing the engagement parameters realized their doctrine was fundamentally flawed. The MiG-25's design assumed it would always detect threats first, allowing it to either engage or escape using superior speed. But American radars detected targets at ranges where the Foxbat's radar saw nothing but noise. American missiles hit Mach 3 targets the Soviets believed were untouchable. Israeli intelligence monitored the Soviet investigation team's activities in Damascus and reported their findings to American counterparts. The message was clear. Soviet confidence in their premier interceptor had been shaken. Syrian pilots, once aggressive in defending their airspace, became cautious. The psychological impact of the loss exceeded its tactical significance. Over the following 16 months, Israeli F-15 Eagles would expand their dominance to levels that defied Soviet military theory. On June 9, 1982, Operation Mole Cricket 19 began with Israeli Air Force strikes against Syrian surface-to-air missile batteries in Lebanon's Bekaa Valley. Syria had deployed 19 Soviet-built SAM batteries, including SA-6 Gainful and SA-8 Gecko systems, creating what Syrian and Soviet advisors believed was an impenetrable air defense network. Israeli F-15s, F-16s, and electronic warfare aircraft destroyed all 19 SAM batteries in less than 2 hours without losing a single aircraft. Syrian MiG-23s, MiG-21s, and MiG-25s scrambled from bases around Damascus to engage the Israeli attackers. Syrian pilots, trained by Soviet instructors using Soviet doctrine, flew in formations designed for mutual support. They expected that numerical superiority and coordinated tactics would overcome any Israeli technological advantages. Soviet doctrine called for massed fighter formations, using numbers to overwhelm technically superior opponents. But June 9th exposed the complete failure of that doctrine. Syrian pilots faced the reality that numerical advantage meant nothing against technological dominance. Israeli F-15 pilots, with their APG-63 radars tracking multiple targets simultaneously, could engage Syrian formations before the Syrians even knew combat had begun. Syrian pilots saw their squadron mates exploding around them without ever detecting the missiles that killed them. Israeli F-15 pilot Moshe Melnik engaged a formation of 4 Syrian MiG-21s that day. His radar tracked all 4 simultaneously, while his fire control computer designated engagement priorities. He fired 4 AM-7 Sparrows in 12 seconds, maintaining radar lock on each target throughout missile flight. All 4 Syrian fighters were destroyed before their pilots understood they were under attack. Captain Relik Shafir, flying another F-15, destroyed 5 Syrian aircraft in 2 separate engagements that afternoon. His first encounter lasted 45 seconds and ended 3 MiG-23s. His second engagement, 2 hours later, destroyed 2 MiG-21s in under 30 seconds. Shafir, interviewed decades later, described the combat as clinical rather than dramatic. The F-15's radar and missiles did the work. The pilot simply followed procedures. By sunset on June 9th, Israeli forces had shot down 82 Syrian aircraft, including MiG-25s, MiG-23s, and MiG-21s. Israel lost 0 aircraft to air combat. The kill ratio, 82-0, represented the most one-sided air battle in jet age history. Soviet advisors observing from Damascus could not explain how their carefully trained Syrian pilots, flying their most advanced exported fighters, had been slaughtered so completely. The Washington Post, citing Pentagon sources, reported on June 15th that Soviet military planners were stunned by the accuracy and efficiency of the Israeli attack. Marshal Pavel Kutakov, Commander-in-Chief of Soviet Air Forces, personally traveled to Syria to investigate. His report to the Soviet Defense Ministry, partially revealed after the Soviet Union's collapse, concluded that Western air combat technology had achieved superiority. Soviet systems could not counter. Syrian MiG-25 pilots, trained to believe their aircraft was untouchable, discovered that Israeli F-15s could track them at any altitude and engage them at any speed. Syrian MiG-21 and MiG-23 pilots knew their aircraft were outclassed, but continued fighting, because retreat meant court-martial. The Syrian Air Force lost its offensive capability in 2 days of combat. By the end of June 1982, Israeli F-15 Eagles had achieved a 58-0 kill ratio against Syrian fighters. Every engagement followed the same pattern. Israeli radar detected Syrian aircraft first, Israeli missiles fired first, Israeli pilots confirmed kills and returned to base, while Syrian formations were still trying to locate their attackers. The technological gap was absolute. Soviet analysts studying Israeli combat reports faced an uncomfortable conclusion. Their exported fighters, flying Soviet doctrine under Soviet-trained pilots advised by Soviet officers, were being massacred by American-designed aircraft using American tactics. The entire foundation of Soviet air combat theory, built on numerical superiority and acceptable loss rates, was obsolete against an enemy with superior technology and training. The Soviet aviation industry's response revealed their understanding of the problem. Development of the MiG-29 and Su-27, fourth-generation fighters designed to match American capabilities, accelerated dramatically. Both aircraft featured fly-by-wire flight controls, pulse Doppler radars, and beyond visual range missiles. Soviet engineers had acknowledged that matching American capabilities required abandoning their design philosophy entirely. But development programs required years, and Soviet forces in the field faced American-designed fighters immediately. The solution was mass production. If Soviet fighters could not match American capabilities individually, the Soviet Union would build thousands of inferior aircraft and overwhelm American forces through sheer numbers. The United States Air Force, observing Israeli F-15 performance, implemented lessons learned into pilot training and tactics development. American pilots studying Israeli gun camera footage saw engagements ending before Syrian pilots could react. The Israelis demonstrated that beyond visual range combat, once controversial in American doctrine, was devastatingly effective when executed properly. When Iraqi MiG-25s attempted to intercept coalition aircraft during Operation Desert Storm in January 1991, American F-15 pilots were prepared. On January 19, 1991, 2 pilots from the 58th Tactical Fighter Squadron achieved the first Air Force F-15 kills of MiG-25 Foxbats. Captain Rick Tolini, callsign Sitgo-21, scored the first kill, followed minutes later by Captain Larry Pitts, callsign Sitgo-22. The engagements followed Israeli established procedures exactly. Both pilots detected Iraqi Foxbats climbing toward coalition strike aircraft, acquired targets at extended range, and fired AIM-7M Sparrow missiles. Both missiles guided perfectly to their targets. The Iraqi aircraft, destroyed during their climb profiles, fell over Iraqi territory. The Iraqi pilots never transmitted distress calls, never fired their own weapons, likely never knew they were under attack until missiles detonated around their cockpits. Iraqi pilots in their MiG-25s faced an impossible situation. Their radar could not detect threats at ranges where American F-15s launched missiles. Their aircraft could not maneuver to evade incoming weapons. Their speed advantage was useless because American missiles were faster. Iraqi Foxbat pilots, trained by Soviet instructors using Soviet doctrine, died exactly as Syrian pilots had died 9 years earlier. Coalition air forces achieved absolute air superiority over Iraq within 72 hours of combat operations beginning. Iraqi fighters that attempted to engage were destroyed immediately. Iraqi fighters that remained grounded were bombed on their airfields. By the third day of combat, surviving Iraqi pilots were fleeing to Iran rather than facing certain death against American, British, and Saudi coalition fighters. The final statistics from Desert Storm validated everything Israeli combat experience had demonstrated. United States Air Force F-15 Eagles achieved 36 confirmed kills with 0 air combat losses. The career record for the F-15, across American and Israeli service, reached 104 air-to-air victories with 0 losses to enemy fighters. The MiG-25, supposedly unstoppable, contributed 2 losses to that total. American industrial capacity supported this dominance with production numbers Soviet industry could not match. McDonnell Douglas produced 1,198 F-15 aircraft in multiple variants between 1972 and 2004. The production facilities at St. Louis, Missouri, operated continuously, with skilled workers assembling complex aircraft using precision manufacturing techniques. Each aircraft required 0.8 million individual parts, 5 miles of electrical wiring, and 3,000 hours of skilled labor. Yet American factories produced them faster and cheaper per unit than Soviet plants built MiG-25s from simple steel and outdated electronics. The quality differential extended beyond the aircraft themselves. Each F-15 engine, the Pratt & Whitney F-100, contained over 10,000 individual parts machined to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. American metallurgy produced turbine blades that could operate at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Soviet engines, while powerful, required overhaul every 150 hours because they operated at temperatures that degraded materials constantly. The training pipeline supporting F-15 operations dwarfed Soviet equivalents. American pilots received 250 hours of flight training before reaching operational squadrons. They flew in aircraft with full instrumentation, practiced against dissimilar aircraft to simulate enemy tactics, and trained in realistic combat scenarios. Israeli pilots often exceeded 400 hours before their first combat mission. They trained against captured Soviet aircraft, understanding enemy capabilities intimately. They studied gun camera footage from actual combat, learning from every engagement. Soviet pilots, limited by fuel shortages and maintenance problems, often reached operational status with under 100 hours total flight time. They practiced standardized intercepts against scripted targets. They learned doctrine through lectures and memorization, rarely questioning whether that doctrine would work against a determined enemy using superior technology. Flight time was rationed because fuel was scarce, and aircraft maintenance consumed resources the Soviet economy could not spare. The quality differential extended beyond pilots to maintenance personnel, logistics systems, and command structures. American squadron mechanics had access to complete technical manuals, unlimited spare parts, and diagnostic equipment. Soviet mechanics often improvised repairs using whatever materials were available, following outdated procedures because updated manuals were classified. A 1988 Soviet Air Force report, declassified after the Soviet Union collapsed, acknowledged these deficiencies with brutal honesty. The report, prepared for Marshal of Aviation Yevgeny Shaposhnikov, concluded that Soviet tactical aviation was 15 to 20 years behind American capabilities. Individual aircraft performance, while improved in newer models, could not compensate for deficiencies in training, maintenance, logistics, and doctrine. The report's most damaging section analyzed combat loss ratios. Israeli F-15s against Syrian Soviet-equipped aircraft showed a 58-0 ratio. American F-15s against Iraqi Soviet-equipped aircraft showed a 36-0 ratio. Even accounting for pilot quality differences, Soviet exported aircraft were demonstrably inferior. The report recommended complete revision of Soviet aviation doctrine and massive investment in fourth-generation fighter development. By 1990, Soviet military leadership understood they had lost the Cold War's aviation competition. The MiG-29 and Su-27 represented honest attempts to match American fourth-generation capabilities, but they arrived 15 years late. Meanwhile, the United States was developing fifth-generation stealth fighters that would render Soviet air defenses obsolete again. In 1994, 3 years after the Soviet Union's collapse, retired Soviet Air Force Captain Alexander Zuyev provided testimony to American aviation historians. Zuyev, who had defected on May 20, 1989 by stealing a MiG-29 and flying it to Turkey, offered insights into Soviet pilot perspectives on American aircraft. "We knew the F-15 was superior to anything we flew. Every pilot who studied Israeli combat reports understood this, but Soviet doctrine told us that individual aircraft quality did not matter because we had numbers. This was a lie we told ourselves to maintain morale. Quality matters. Training matters. Logistics matter. The Americans and Israelis had all three. We had courage and numerical superiority. History proved courage is not enough." Zuyev's testimony about the MiG-25 specifically was devastating. The Foxbat was a propaganda weapon dressed as a fighter. Its purpose was intimidating the West, not winning wars. When Belenko defected and handed the Americans a complete aircraft in 1976, the deception died completely. After that, the Foxbat became an embarrassment. We continued flying because scrapping it would admit the failure publicly. Aviation historian Walter Boyne, analyzing Soviet and American fighter development in his 2003 book, concluded that the MiG-25 represented the ultimate expression of Soviet aviation philosophy. Soviet designers optimized for production simplicity, maintenance by minimally trained personnel, and operation under austere conditions. They accepted poor combat performance because they planned to overwhelm enemies with numbers. This philosophy worked when fighting Nazi Germany, which Soviet forces defeated through massive numerical superiority and acceptable horrific casualties. But it failed completely against Western air forces that emphasized technology, training, and tactics. One well-trained pilot in an F-15 was worth dozens of mediocre pilots in MiG-25s. The mathematics of modern air combat favored quality over quantity. The Museum of Flight in Seattle, Washington displays a MiG-25P interceptor acquired after the Soviet Union's dissolution. The placard describes it as the fastest fighter ever produced, capable of reaching Mach 3.2. But the extended description, based on declassified CIA analysis, notes its crude construction, obsolete electronics, and limited combat capability. Visitors see an aircraft that looks formidable, but was actually a product of Soviet industrial limitations and propaganda requirements rather than sound military engineering. The F-15 Eagle continues flying with multiple air forces worldwide. Israel operates F-15 Pointe variants with advanced avionics and upgraded engines. Saudi Arabia flies F-15 SA models with modernized radar and weapons. The United States Air Force operates F-15EX variants, the latest evolution of a design that first flew 50 years ago. Total F-15 production will exceed 1,500 aircraft, and the type shows no signs of retirement. The contrast between these two aircraft, conceived within 5 years of each other as responses to similar threats, demonstrates the fundamental difference between Soviet and American aviation development. The Soviet Union built an interceptor to destroy one specific bomber, using minimal technology and simple construction. The United States built an air superiority fighter designed to defeat any opponent in any scenario using the best available technology. When these two philosophies met in combat, the results were never in doubt. Syrian pilots in MiG-25s discovered their speed meant nothing against radar-guided missiles launched from beyond visual range. Iraqi pilots learned the same lesson at even greater cost. The MiG-25's reputation, built on Soviet propaganda and Western fear, collapsed when subjected to combat reality. The Syrian pilot killed on February 13, 1981, became the first Foxbat combat loss. His death proved what Western intelligence had suspected since Viktor Belenko's defection. The MiG-25 was not the unstoppable interceptor Soviet propaganda claimed. It was a steel construction designed to fight bombers that no longer existed, flown by pilots trained in doctrine that modern combat had rendered obsolete. The Israeli Air Force preserved gun camera footage from that engagement, showing the Sparrow missiles tracking their supersonic target and detonating with lethal precision. The film demonstrates perfect execution of beyond visual range combat tactics, using technological superiority to eliminate an enemy without entering the visual arena where speed or maneuverability could matter. Soviet aviation never recovered from the credibility damage inflicted by Israeli and American F-15 operations. After decades of claiming their interceptors were the world's best, Soviet leaders faced documented evidence that Western fighters destroyed Soviet aircraft at will. The kill ratios, approaching 100-0 in Israeli service and remaining perfect in American service, could not be explained away as pilot error or tactical mistakes. Soviet aircraft were inferior. Soviet training was inferior. Soviet doctrine was inferior. The MiG-25 Foxbat remained in limited service until the early 2000s, primarily in reconnaissance roles where its speed remained useful. But its combat career effectively ended in February 1981 when Israeli pilot Benny Zinker fired 2 missiles and destroyed the myth of Soviet interceptor invincibility. The engagement lasted seconds. The strategic implications lasted decades. The F-15 Eagle, designed to establish American air superiority and never compromise that superiority for any other capability, achieved exactly what its designers intended. It proved that quality defeats quantity, that training multiplies technology, and that sound engineering based on combat reality will always defeat propaganda, engineering based on political requirements. Soviet Marshal Kutuzov, investigating the Bekaa Valley disaster in June 1982, reportedly told his staff that the Soviet Union had spent 30 years building the wrong air force. His comment, recorded in meeting minutes that survived the Soviet collapse, captured the essence of Soviet aviation's failure. They had optimized for the last war, building interceptors to stop bomber formations that would never come, while the Americans prepared for the next war with fighters designed to dominate any combat scenario. The statistics tell the complete story. MiG-25 combat record: dozens of losses to F-15 Eagles, F-16 Fighting Falcons and other Western fighters. MiG-25 confirmed air-to-air victories, 0. F-15 Eagle combat record: 104 victories, 0 losses to enemy aircraft. The disparity is absolute and undeniable. When Soviet engineers examined captured F-15 components after the Cold War ended, they found American engineering philosophy completely different from their own. American designers had pursued performance without regard for production simplicity. They used exotic materials, complex systems, and expensive components to achieve superiority in every measurable parameter. The F-15 cost 3 times what a MiG-25 cost to produce, but it was worth 30 MiG-25s in combat effectiveness. This was the lesson Soviet aviation learned too late. In modern air combat, the side with better technology, better training, and better tactics wins decisively. Numerical superiority means nothing when your aircraft are detected first, engaged first, and destroyed before you can respond. The Soviet Air Force built thousands of MiG-25s expecting to overwhelm enemies through numbers. Instead, they created thousands of targets for American missiles. The myth of the MiG-25 died in Lebanese airspace on a February afternoon in 1981. Syrian confidence in Soviet technology died with it. The reality of American aviation superiority, demonstrated by an Israeli F-15 pilot executing beyond visual range tactics with devastating precision, transformed Cold War air power calculations completely. Soviet generals had called the Foxbat unstoppable. Israeli pilots proved them wrong in seconds. The thunder of those missile detonations echoed through Soviet military planning for the remainder of the Cold War, a sound that announced the end of Soviet aviation credibility and the beginning of absolute American air dominance.